Welcome. History is an evidence-based discipline, but should all evidence be taken at face value? This is one of the most interesting and difficult questions involved in analyzing sources, but especially written texts. In daily interaction, all kinds of things mitigate whether our words are taken literally. For example, there's the tone of our voice. Maybe we sound sarcastic, or maybe we say something while laughing. There are also nonverbal cues, such as body language. If we roll our eyes while speaking, we send two messages at once: the message of our words, but also the message of our eyes. But regrettably, none of this applies to written sources. Texts lack nonverbal cues like body language, and no text has a tone of voice. If we hear a tone in our heads, then that tone is literally in our head, and we can't blame it on the text author. But does this mean that every text is literal? Chances are, probably not. So today, we'll pay special attention to a series of political texts as we take a deep dive into how rhetoric can function in written sources. At the most basic level, rhetoric is persuasive speech. The word rhetoric comes from the word rhetor, which is found in both Greek and Latin. In the ancient world, it denoted a public speaker. Rhetoric entailed using particular speaking strategies, especially in public assemblies. Rhetorical strategies are also known as rhetorical devices, and sometimes they're used in written sources too. Then as now, rhetoric sometimes carried a negative connotation, like if someone says that something is just rhetoric. They mean that it's empty, possibly insincere speech. But in what now follows, we don't mean rhetoric in this negative sense. Rather, we're interested in rhetoric as persuasion. Before continuing, however, we need to make a distinction. For much of history, the study of rhetoric has been paired with the study of logic. Rhetoric is persuasive speech. Persuasive because it appeals to your emotions. Logic, however, is about how to reason, and thus appeals to the intellect. Because rhetoric appeals to the emotions, training in logic would ideally function as a check on the use and abuse of rhetorical devices. This could be done by avoiding logical fallacies, that is, errors made in the reasoning process that cause the conclusion to be invalid. Let's look at how this might work, comparing rhetoric and logic. A popular rhetorical device is hyperbole, that is, exaggerated speech. Classic indicators are words like always or never. Of course, some things are always true, and other things are never true, but many more things fall somewhere between these two poles. One function of hyperbole is to reduce an argument to a clear-cut distinction between good and bad. Exaggeration appeals to emotion, not logic. This may be highly effective, but that doesn't mean it's good reasoning. For example, let's say that you're home for the holidays and you get into an argument about politics during a family dinner. If they accuse you of being always wrong, then they've used hyperbole, that is, exaggeration. From the standpoint of logic, however, hyperbole is a problem. It can even be considered a logical fallacy. Let's try another example, but one still at the dinner table. What if, instead of saying that you are always wrong, they instead say, you're on the wrong side of history? This is an example of the ad populum fallacy. Ad populum literally means to the people. It uses peer pressure to persuade someone to change their position. But peer pressure isn't evidence, and in the present case, you can't even test the claim about history having a side, because all of history hasn't happened yet. Rhetorical arguments are appealing because they're emotionally satisfying, maybe for better, maybe for worse. However, by using logic, we can critique or even limit the appeal of rhetoric. Let's now think about rhetoric in a second way. We've just looked at two arguments that stirred up emotion. But what if we use words or concepts already laden with emotion? This is also a form of persuasive speech. And here's an example. In 1983, at the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals, President Ronald Reagan delivered what has come to be known as the Evil Empire speech. In it, he connected three things. First, contentious political issues such as abortion and school prayer. Second, socialism, namely Soviet socialism, and its rejection of both religion and any morality based upon it. And third and finally, the push for a freeze on developing and testing nuclear weapons. A freeze was strongly supported by many members of the Democratic Party. On all of these issues, the president took a clear-cut line. In the conclusion of his speech, he told those gathered, "In your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil." On the one hand, the evil empire was clearly the Soviet Union, but was it just the Soviet Union? You could argue that President Reagan's invocation of the Soviets is a good example of multivalence, also known as polyvalence. This happens when something has more than one meaning. If we read the president's remarks about an evil empire as an example of multivalence, then the evil empire denotes not just the Soviets, but other political opponents too. First, the American Democratic Party, and then, second, those who supported the nuclear freeze. So, multivalent denotes having more than one meaning. But what do we do if these various meanings are either inconsistent or even in conflict with one another? This is called semantic confusion. By way of example, let's continue with socialism. Today we think of socialism in terms of Marxism, because in the 20th century, Marxism became the dominant form of socialism. If we go back to the 19th century, we find two things. First, Marxism was actually a late development. Second, and consequently, there were many non-Marxist socialist groups. Some held beliefs utterly opposed to what became Marxist orthodoxy. If we pan out and look at the various 19th century socialists, it is clear that these groups used the term socialism in fundamentally incompatible ways. And this is the difference between semantic confusion and multivalence. If something is multivalent, it has more than one meaning. The meanings might be unrelated, but they aren't antagonistic to one another. Semantic confusion, however, denotes multiple incompatible meanings. Those meanings might coexist in time and space, as in the case of all the 19th century groups that called themselves socialist. Semantic confusion isn't technically about rhetoric, but it could be. Consider the following. What if someone calls you a fascist? Are they doing this because the word fascist seems like an accurate descriptor? Or are they making a rhetorical and thus emotional appeal? Of course, you can't know for sure what they think. All you can do is use the available evidence to make a well-reasoned argument about whether the more plausible explanation is descriptive accuracy or rhetorical persuasion. Let's briefly recap. Rhetoric is about persuasive speech. It usually appeals to the emotions. But logic is about the reasoning process. It usually appeals to the intellect. Granted, historical sources aren't usually like holiday dinners. And yet, chances are, when a speech was first given, or a source first written, the author was trying to persuade their original audience of something. They may have used a rhetorical device, such as hyperbole, but they might also have used rhetoric in other ways too, appealing to the emotions by invoking an enemy or using clear-cut moral language. Such arguments depend on emotion rather than logic. However, rhetoric is also used when writing a paper. Rhetorically effective writing is persuasive writing. For example, building up to your biggest arguments is more effective than starting with your biggest arguments before moving on to those that are smaller. It's probably safe to say that rhetoric is inevitable, even if we aren't analyzing the use of rhetorical devices. Yes, rhetoric can cause problems. We won't always know whether to take something at face value. But if we're attuned to the possibility of rhetoric in our sources, we'll be that much closer to understanding them. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.